Good morning, fellow summiteers. It's a pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to this closing panel for the annual 2020 New Hampshire Summit on Systemic Inclusion. We have a wonderful lineup of all-stars for this closing conversation on a really exciting, challenging topic that we think could be a really wonderful pivot to moving forward and to really saying, okay, what's the next generation of challenge that we all want to take on together as a community of stakeholders from banking, education, workforce development, and philanthropy who want to address poverty systemically and help LMI kids and their families move out of intergenerational poverty as the overarching shared passion of everybody in this community. That said, welcome to this closing panel on harvesting promising CRA-supported practices. And this is really about thinking about how can we better harvest CRA-supported practices so that we can better scale efforts that have promising and proven impact on systemic inclusion. So that said, it's a delight to be joined on this panel. It's quite an honor to be joined by Jason, Kristy, and Barry. And if you would each kindly introduce yourselves. And Jason, if you kindly introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. This is Jason Keller with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. I sit in the 7th district of the 12 Federal Reserve banks with geographic responsibility for portions of Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and all of Iowa. But my interest in this topic is national. So I very much appreciate being part of this conversation. I sit in a group called Community Development and Policy Studies, which was really established after the passage of the CRA in the 1980s to help financial institutions comply with what is honestly a very complicated regulation. So it's good to be a part of this group and looking forward to the dialogue.
Thank you, Jason. Kristy, could you do the honors, please?
Sure. Well, good morning and thank you, Bob. I appreciate the invitation, and it's my honor to be on the panel with some very esteemed colleagues here. So thank you. Kristy Merrill, president of the New Hampshire Bankers Association, have been having conversations with Bob for a couple of years now, or at least I think it's about a couple of years, about ways that we can work together. And I really applaud him for looking at ways to maximize CRA to how we can help solve a problem that I think we all agree is out there. So just looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Kristy. And it's an incredible pleasure to collaborate with you as well. And we'll be sharing about a lot of exciting initiatives as this conversation evolves this morning. And Barry, again, welcome and thank you. If you kindly introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. Barry Whitus. I'm Deputy Comptroller for Community Affairs at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. We're a bureau of the U.S. Treasury. We supervise national banks and federal savings associations, and our unit both works on CRA, Community Investment Act policy development, as well as economic inclusion. And we also are developing a whole program, as I discussed on the last panel, called Project Reach, which is partnerships between banks and civil rights organizations and our agency to help promote systemic economic inclusion through the development of new initiatives. And then we also, as we'll discuss on a panel this morning, produce best practices publications and how-to guides for banks that are interested in pursuing various types of community economic development programs. I also have a team of community affairs officers throughout the country. Benita Irving, who was on participated on the last panel and maybe on this one as well in the audience, is our community affairs officer assigned to New England, working out of Boston.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. And thank you for referencing your colleague, Benita Irving, as well, who I see is indeed on this call also. So our agenda for this final session is very straightforward and simple. We've introduced ourselves, and I'm Bob McLaughlin with the National Collaborative for Digital Equity. And I've been, as I think most folks on this call know, I've been obsessing about the potential impacts on poverty of partnerships between banks and foundations and workforce development folks and philanthropic leaders. And so this conversation is the culmination of a long-held dream. Really excited about this. And what we're going to do first is provide a very brief context for our conversation, and then we'll go into some straightforward discussion questions to get the conversation really going into high gear. One of the concerns that motivated us at the National Collaborative in wanting to have this kind of conversation this morning is that if you round up by about 20 billion or so, a mere 20 billion, we're up to about nearly $500 billion a year now that banks are committing to address poverty in one or more ways as part of their obligation to meet their CRA, their Community Reinvestment Act compliance requirements. And so that's obviously a vast sum. And I can say as a non-banker that so it's objective for, I think, for me to say that there are a great many promising and proven CRA-supported strategies that do improve important dimensions of poverty with, for example, regard to long-held CRA purposes around affordable housing, financial literacy, financial inclusion, access to banking services, capital and credit, economic inclusion, strengthening pathways, inclusive pathways to living wage employment. And recently, as Barry was sharing this morning, the OCC and Federal Reserve and FDIC have recently been clarifying more and more emphatically the eligibility for interested banks of receiving CRA credit for removing digital divide barriers to these kinds of other dimensions of poverty. So, for example, remove digital divide barriers to economic opportunity. And so there's a lot of really exciting creative work going on in the CRA ecosystem. Yet I can say, as somebody standing at the periphery of the CRA ecosystem, that it strikes me, and I really want to, we'll reframe this in the form of a question in a moment, but my own perception is that it's really challenging for non-bankers and I think for bankers to learn about one another's promising and particularly proven CRA-supported practices that actually have been found likely or definitely to yield impact on important metrics related to poverty. And that, for example, when one searches the academic literature on what do we know about CRA strategies that are positively correlated with gains in important economic inclusion metrics, there's very little literature. And so I'm very eager, Barry, you mentioned just a moment ago about the best practices publications. That's something that's certainly going to be pertinent for this conversation. And I think sharing with all of us what is being done by bankers, for example, Kristy, the New Hampshire Bankers Association, and the mothership, the American Bankers Association, and the regulatory agencies around sharing practices will be very helpful. In the largest context of all, for this whole conversation, of course, as we all know, we're living in this unprecedented pandemic era economy, and it's really calling on us to up our game as best we can, all of us together. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity to improve the impactfulness of CRA investments and moving beyond compliance, not negating the necessity of compliance requirements for CRA, because that goes to the heart of the purpose of CRA, but really moving from compliance to impact. We're now, I think it's fair to say, on the cusp of entering a new era in the American economy that's much like what was the case in European cities at the end of World War II, where they were largely in rubble and needed to rebuild. And as we look at an imminent massive wave of foreclosures and homelessness and evictions and other impacts on small businesses. We're looking at tremendous economic stressors. And so here we have this nearly $500 billion ecosystem that's all about infusing support to alleviate poverty. And what can we do together to improve our game? So the first question for all of us of four, and then we'll open to Q&A, folks. So please feel most welcome to provide some comments in the chat and some comments and questions. We'll come to those in a few moments. But first, do we agree that much more can be done to quote unquote harvest and share information on promising and proven CRA practices that address poverty? Is that an accurate perception, or is that off base a bit? Just open that up for our colleagues.
Bob, I'm happy to jump in on that. I do agree with that. And I think sharing proven CRA practices is always a welcome thing. I think bankers are always happy to see that, and they want to have the best practices and they want to know what's worked. And so I do think that there's some opportunity there. And, I think it's interesting that you've got that word harvest in quotations. I think that banks of all sizes really, they do comply with CRA, but they're very connected to their communities. And so while, they do have to comply with CRA, I think they're very invested in their communities outside of the CRA, requirements as well. And so I think what you're really looking to do, and so while I agree that there can be more done to harvest, I think the emphasis that you've brought to it, Bob, that I see is that there is an opportunity to kind of coordinate and to really put a focus on the efforts by banks to comply with CRA, to really try to get at some of these issues that we're dealing with, like affordable housing and financial literacy and some of these things. So I think banks certainly are doing them, but there is certainly room to coordinate. And I appreciate that you've had that focus.
Thank you, Kristy. Other colleagues on the panel, your thoughts. Does this seem like a valid perception that we can do more? Do others share that with Kristy and me?
I mean, I'll jump in this, Barry. I think that a lot exists out there, whether it meets the academics, your academic standard or other PhDs academic standard of, statistical, provability is probably not a goal that I would try to pursue personally. I think it puts too much of a time lag between the development of an idea, the proving of an idea to, for research purposes, if I'm sort of reading your thing right, and then sort of presenting the results and saying, okay, everybody, we've proven this. So now, really this is the best financial literacy program, or this is the best way to finance affordable housing. I think, what we've looked at in terms of our publications at the OCC is what we sort of know anecdotally through a lot of research that's done by organizations like the Urban Institute, Brookings Institute. These are organizations, plus the trades, the Washington trade organizations, the National Association of Home Builders, National Association of Realtors. There's a lot of good sources of what, and the American bankers. I should mention them as well. We all have anecdotal driven best practice work, and OCC's website, occ.gov, and Community Affairs page, probably has 60 publications that you can go to. Everything from, investing in small business investment companies. Bob, we did a whole publication recently on best practices in terms of financing rural broadband, looking at the various financing tools. And my experience is that banks like to to look at leveraging government programs, other credit support programs, credit enhancements that can help mitigate some of the risk. And so banks are kind of assume that if you have a new markets tax credit that's supporting a rural broadband build out, that's taking a significant portion of the risk and providing a subsidy, that's good enough for them. That they obviously need to understand the underwriting and how to mitigate their risk, but they can rely on the existing sources of information to say, yeah, this is a good thing to do. We know that's financing rural broadband in an area where there's excessive costs for people to pay for the last mile themselves. So getting farmers in that area hooked up and making them giving them access to internet that can make them bank customers, and their kids can be more effective doing homework and doing home-based learning. It doesn't take a ton of research to sort of conceptualize your way to the answer of what needs to be done. So I personally wouldn't get up as hung up on the amount of research that needs to be done to prove it's a practice, and rely more on people's judgment. And I find bankers, as I said a moment ago, will gravitate towards government programs, state programs, particularly ones that help mitigate some of their risk.
That's very helpful. Jason, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll give the standard disclaimer that anything I'm about to say is of my own opinion, but I'm very much interested in this idea of CRA storytelling. And when I speak nationally, I often talk to bankers about how they tell their CRA-related story. But I think, as I said yesterday during my prepared remarks, is that CRA is retroactive. So a rating that comes out today is really only reflecting a bank's participation in CRA-supported practices 2, 3, 4, potentially 5 years back, depending on their asset size and charter and whatnot. So I think banks need to do a better job of talking about CRA real time. And I will often go into financial institutions and just ask them, whose responsibility is does CRA fall under? And there's obviously myriad of answers there, but the best answer is really everyone's. It's not the CRA officer, it's not the bank president, it's not the board of directors, it's not the CRA committee that a lot of institutions often have. It's really everyone's. And I think awareness, especially within your regional and larger banks, awareness of what banks are given credit for really needs to be top of mind from a marketing perspective. And I really do see CRA as a competitive advantage for institutions that are looking to be innovative, looking to be complex, looking to have their finger on the pulse of what's happening and what that need is in that given community. And the other part of this question that I was drawn to in thinking about it was addressing poverty. And while we know that this is a mass need, I think the better CRA officers out there are also thinking about preventing slippage, if you will. So how, low and moderate, how are you preventing moderate income individuals from slipping into low, or from low slipping into impoverished conditions? You really want to think about those that have access, that may be just on the cusp of getting over that Mendoza line versus also being on the cusp of falling backwards. So as you start to think about this holistically as a community, what's out there to help those who really need it, yes, but also those who might just need a little bit of help to keep them from slipping backwards.
And Jason, what you just shared about the slippage concept for me really resonates with what you were sharing earlier this week in your kind remarks, particularly about the benefits cliff, for example, right? I mean, it's those that finally get from unemployment to underemployment, but it's actually unsustainable for them because they lose, ironically, they lose access to subsidized healthcare, let's say, and childcare. So they're barriers, that these sort of cost barriers prevent them from progressing into living wage employment. So this notion of slippage is very helpful. really want to resonate too, Barry, with your insight that it should not necessarily be about empirically validated strategies with hard quantitative evidence. I personally resonate with that, which sounds like I'm contradicting myself, which I suppose I am a little bit, because I would like to see some kind of empirical research in this ecosystem, because I look in the aggregate at this being a nearly $500 billion enterprise with very, very little empirical knowledge about how to optimize the impact. That said, I am also, having spent my whole career in education, I think we're in the same boat. There are a lot of wonderful, promising practices that don't need validation, that can and should be replicated and adapted by practitioners. And you're doing a lot of, you're all doing a lot of great work to share. For example, the State Bankers Association and all the ways in which, Kristy, you and your colleagues learn about and share your best practices with one another. And the federal agencies with your publications and your webinars now, and with the National Interagency Conference on Community Reinvestment is an amazing kind of venue as well. What I'm wondering is, do you see some important barriers that to sharing information that you think ought to be noted? And let me just, to get the ball rolling on that, what I personally mean by that, as an example, is that banks, and I can understand, as I say this, I can understand the downside of the following as a possible policy, but I would like to float the idea of what if we were to give banks the option, interested banks, the option, not the expectation, that they could allocate as much as, let's say, 0.5% of their CRA resources for impact assessment and sharing of practice, and optional so that it doesn't thwart innovation and because one of the downsides of making something high stakes, which education learned with No Child Left Behind, is paradoxically that actually thwarts innovation. If folks know that they have to deliver impact, they're not going to try something new and unproven and experiment with it. So we obviously want to encourage lots of experimentation and innovation, but are there ways in which we can be contributing, even if it's qualitative storytelling, as you're saying, Jason? Are there ways in which we can be looking at sharing more effectively? Because I look at the last thing I'll say on this question is that I look at the reports that are prepared in, you know, at the end of an examination of a bank's compliance, and it's very labor intensive to mine those reports for information, for nuggets, and unless that bank happens to do workshops or webinars or in some way shares about what they're doing, it's really, there's a lot of great stuff that's just lost in reports that sit on shelves, digital or otherwise. Make sense?
Bob, if it's okay with you, I just want to add a comment to the first question. You know, I thought Jason's comments about looking at CRA from a marketing perspective was kind of interesting. And, you know, I agree. I think there's some opportunity there. And I'll just add that, you know, here in New Hampshire, we have a couple of banks that are certified B Corps. And I think they are doing that because they view themselves as, you know, it's one way to market themselves as a good place to work, but it also kind of shows where their heart is in terms of the relation of and their investment in the community. So I think CRA could be seen along those same lines as well. But I just thought that was an interesting point that Jason made about you know, the marketing side of things as well.
Yeah, and thanks, Kristy. But I'll also say that the reverse side of that is that banks, by their nature, are confidential organizations and are often not encouraged to share things publicly about what they fund, what they don't, who's on what committee, who serves on what board, because there's always that reputational risk of, let's be honest, some backlash that could come from organizations that are not being served by that bank. So to me, it's a very delicate a fine line about what is shared, who shares it, and when it's shared. But I think that barrier itself, it's going to be different for every bank. Some banks are very public about their CRA related strategies, and some are not. But it's understanding the mission. It's understanding whether they're B Corp designated, what their CDFI funding strategy might look like, potentially if they have a separate foundation under their holding company. There's different ways to understand what a bank's interest point would be from CRA, but we also have to realize that CRA is not just philanthropic dollars. It's not just straight donations that banks are making. Again, as I said yesterday, banks are looking and should be looking for a rate of return, whether that be below market or even a nominal fee. Banks have to be in the business of making money. Now, what they do with that money is going to be subject to different management structures and charters. But as we think about this is really a great question.
Jason, I'll just add to that, and I agree that banks are very confidential, and it's interesting because working as for the association that represents banks, one of the challenges I see is that the banks themselves are very reluctant to tell their story. And so I really feel like our role at the association is to be that storyteller. And so our banks are hearing from me all the time about, what are you doing? And I'm constantly asking them for information they can share so we can try to do that. But I agree that, I think the nature of banking is that they don't feel comfortable sharing some of that. So, I do think that's a barrier to some degree, but I certainly think it's one that can be overcome. And like I said, I see the role of the association is trying to help with that for sure. I'll just add that another barrier, and Jason and Barry probably won't want to hear this, but won't be surprised. CRA is very much alive and evolving right now with so much that's going on in this space. I know that the OCC, they've come out with their modernization effort on CRA, and the Fed has as well. And we're still waiting to hear from the FDIC. And so, I would just say from a regulatory point of view, what would be very helpful is if those three agencies are really unified. And I know that they know this, and I'm sure they've heard it elsewhere, but I think that'd be very helpful. And there definitely are some positive with where the CRA reform is going. Having a list of acceptable activities is very helpful. I know there's a size, I think, of 2.5 billion where, banks can kind of opt in if they go with the new model or the old model. I think that's very helpful. There's a lot that we're still trying to understand, but I think having the unity among the regulators would be helpful. And I know they're all trying to get there. But as that continues to evolve, I think that certainly would be helpful to bankers.
Hi, thank you for your comments, Kristy and Jason. I did see a very interesting comment in the chat box that I wanted to highlight. And this has to do with, when an organization or a business is approaching a bank, about a CRA activity, and maybe it's one that the bank is not familiar with or never used. And it's, the interest of seeing the organization tell the story and to back it up with data. To me, if you have an organization that says, if you contribute $1 million towards our apprenticeship program, we think that with that $1 million, we'll get, 200 people into jobs in businesses, within X period of time, and here's our track record. To me, that's essential for any deal. If somebody's going to pitch a bank on a deal, I, as a banker, am going to want to see, how can you show me, quantitatively, how you're achieving your results. I'm sort of railing at this notion that, I hear a lot in Washington where, you have a program that's been reviewed, but maybe not peer-reviewed research effective in terms of serving a particular need in the population, or, take the CDFI industry. That's a very significant growth of institutions of CDFIs over the last 20, 25 years, there's been periodic studies of, what, how effective CDFIs are. Should Congress continue to appropriate money to fund them and so forth? And, I think we have more and more banks that have experience with CDFIs, and I wouldn't want to get hung up on, well, maybe it's not as effective as it could be, or maybe we need more research on it. I just wouldn't, let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But I did want to get back to the person who made the comment in the chat box that, my comments about research, are really sort of at the macro level, and any organization that promotes a deal to a bank, I think, should have its facts and figures to show it's going to be effective.
This is very thought-provoking. One of the experiences that I've had working with a bank when we first developed our at NCDE our guide to CRA funding for digital equity and economic inclusion, we worked with a bank that had and continues to have several years later a wonderful portfolio of really exemplary, trailblazing work around addressing the digital divide. And they gave us lots of examples of CRA eligible ways in which they have developed to address the digital divide, and they didn't want themselves mentioned. And one of the barriers that and I was really baffled, saying, "You're really doing amazing things. I'd like to thank you for giving us all this insight, and for letting folks know who this is that's doing all this amazing work." And one of the things they said is that one of the downsides of if a bank X becomes known as really trailblazing in CRA support for, let's say, digital inclusion, that they might then get a lot of people banging on their door, and they're not set up. They don't have the staffing. They don't want to invest in the cost of the staffing, as well as have to handle the optics of saying no to lots of people that apply for competitive, let's say, a competitive grant program. They're not, the CRA office is often not configured as a foundation with a grant making, program that issues requests for proposals. That's a different business. And so what they're saying is, we really don't want to have the undesirable pressure on top of compliance of having to say no to lots and lots of people and adjudicating and staffing the review process. But that said, I think I come back also to Kristy, what you were saying moments ago. I think there is a very genuine, truly endearing humility that I find in a lot of people that do the CRA compliance work, that they're doing really lovely work. And it is about, as Kristy, you were saying, it is about impacting the community. And there's a real dedication to that. And it's not necessarily to promote themselves at all. But again, I find that the net result of all these barriers tends to be that it's from my vantage point, it's harder than it might be to find out about and replicate really cool stuff, whether it's empirically validated with peer-reviewed, methodology or not. But I think it's harder to find out about impactful practice, and I think we're in desperate need of making that easier. Would be what I would say to that, if that makes sense. And so let's, if we can pivot, let's see. I actually, Michael, if you could, Michael Young, if you would share your comment out from chat. You've raised a great point here.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I just wanted to echo the wariness of kind of the evidence-based practice, gold standard, double blind, those, there's the time lapse that you guys mentioned. And then there's also just the cost. I mean, to really get that kind of research done is super expensive. And so there's a risk in sort of, while we want to look for best practice, there's a risk in getting locked into that. And I know you weren't saying that, Bob, necessarily. So my question is about sort of banks collaborating on funding programming, and it's interesting as you bring that idea up about just the capacity that a local bank you know, or the local branch might have to manage their community investing. But I'm curious if there's barriers around banks collaborating, because they're, you know, competing to a degree, you know, and maybe it's kind of easier and better for their storytelling to just fund something on their own, something maybe even sort of hyper local, you know, or is it so win-win that actually pulling banks together is, it's just a logistical thing. The only barrier is time and relationship. It's not actually seen as something a bank wouldn't want to do. So I'm curious about banks collaborating on, you know, CRA projects.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Michael. I would say that in my experience, if there is a overarching force that's sort of bringing the banks together, be it a governor's initiative or a mayor's initiative, or, you know, some broad initiative that is bringing banks together because it's something that they know needs to be addressed and maybe is having a financial impact on their bottom line, but they don't either have the resources to tackle it individually, or, you know, worse, you know, each bank is trying to tackle it a different way. And I think, for example, of a lot of smaller towns that, you know, are coming together to say, we really want to put together a Main Street program. We have a beautiful town square, and half the buildings are boarded up on the town square, but that's where our county seat is, and that's where, you know, one of the major churches in the area is, and so, you know, they view revitalizing the town square as an initiative that they'll all benefit from, because maybe some of their banks are right there in the downtown of that small town that's sort of experiencing hard times. So, you know, to the extent that the mayor comes in or the governor comes in and says, you know, we're going to undertake an initiative, and, you know, then I tend to see those collaborations happening where it's very specific and it's very much in each of their best interests, and they know that they couldn't tackle it alone. So that's an example I've seen where the collaboration can work, but it usually isn't one bank going to the others and saying, oh, if we all sort of do this, and, you know, then we can fix up the town square. Sometimes it happens that way, and maybe it's done through the Chamber of Commerce, but a lot of times it's done, you know, under the auspices of a program, of a governmental program and a governmental push in some way.
Yep, and this is Jason. I'll echo Barry's comments with also a real life example in that remember that financial institutions are very they are discouraged from investing or funding or participating in any entity, product, program, or service that may be potentially not safe or sound. So we still want individual institutions to do their own individual underwriting, their own due diligence, their own understanding of the process. And when you start sharing or risk taking together, there can be some fuzzy lines. So I agree with Barry that if there's a third party, an instigator, a community quarterback, a government agency, a CDFI, a nonprofit, something that's sort of gathering this and putting some of their own backbone into it, that you're going to have stronger opportunities for collaboration. But there's, you know, shared risk taking is difficult for banks, but as it should be. You know, you don't want banks just following another's lead. You still want them to be able to go through and do their own process.
I would also say, just to try to answer Michael's question about, you know, whether or not they don't want to collaborate because they want to sort of have their own stories. I guess I see that as less of an issue. I can't say that's not out there, but I think more so it truly is just the logistics of getting people together in relationships and having a coordinated purpose. But I think similar to what Barry was saying, you know, Operation Lemonade that Bob has a big role in. I think that's a really good example where you've got banks in the Manchester area that feel that there's really an opportunity there to work together. So I think when there is the ability to bring folks together for a shared interest, you know, whether that's geographic or a subject area, I think those opportunities exist. And, you know, earlier this year, as the association, we were hoping to host a week of community service for the banking industry. So, we know that a lot of our banks do this anyways, and we were going to have a week called New Hampshire Banks Give Back. It unfortunately was impacted by the pandemic, and so we weren't able to do that as we had hoped. But, we had received a lot of interest from our members, and the idea was simply to be that, we had asked the banks that if they had community service, that they would just coordinate it to 1 week during the year, all being the same week, and that we could kind of try to promote the good work being done by the industry. And I'm sure you all know that the banks plan these things well in advance, and they have a budget and they try to coordinate their efforts. So I was disappointed that we weren't able to pull that together, but I think it highlights the fact that they are willing to work together, and there, I think, are opportunities there.
And Kristy, I really want to echo what you were saying about the banks that are working together in Operation Lemonade. What Kristy's kindly referring to is this amazing collaboration among a dozen banking leaders with operations in the city of Manchester, who are doing a fundraising campaign to really close the digital divide for low-income kids in K-12 in the city, which has a very high free and reduced lunch eligible student population. And they're doing some very inspiring work together. And they're finding that one of the biggest payoffs of working together is that it makes the challenge of financing 1,000 devices for low-income kids who need them for home access during COVID. That's conceivable when you bring them all together and pool their assets with all the other competing demands they have on their CRA resources. To pivot a little bit and to maybe a different perspective, a different way of framing the perception that that more can be done to harvest promising and proven practices. One of the things that I found, and Barry will appreciate this, is one of the first things we talked about in our first conversation, is that I was Darth Vader for the New Hampshire Department of Education. As Kristy knows, I've shared this with you too, that I was the bad guy who was responsible for a very small accountability system, a smidgen microscope of a microscopic in comparison to the enormous CRA ecosystem. But we found something that strikes me as similar. So the accountability system I inherited was responsible for assessing teacher education programs and making sure that they are, when they recommend candidates for certification to become professional teachers, that they've got a good quality control system that we can trust. So when they recommend a candidate, we can trust them. That was the purpose. Well, the assessment reports were, we asked the institution to self-assess, and then we would come in and look at, like auditors do, okay, how accurate are their assertions of their compliance with state standards? So very similar there too. And the format of the reports was, what standards are you meeting, and where you're not meeting them, what are you doing about that? And then we'd bring an external evaluation team, and they would go standard met, standard met, standard met. And oh my God, standard not met. And they'd have a SWAT team rappelling down the side of the building, crashing through the window, throwing flashbang grenades, sirens going off, and saying, you're not meeting the standard. And where this became problematic, and I mean, this is all well-intentioned by everybody involved, but when those reports got to the State Board of Education, all they ever heard, which I think is very true with banks and CRA, is standard met, and occasionally they'll hear outstanding, but mostly satisfactory, or oh my gosh, unsatisfactory. And what the state board was hearing was a steady diet of boring standard met, standard met, standard met, and oh my God, standard not met. And so they got this misapprehension that teacher educators weren't really diligent and committed to the best possible outcomes for their students and the K-12 students that they were going to be prepared to teach. And I think that something similar, from my vantage point, is happening in the CRA ecosystem, that we're not getting the story out well enough about all the amazing things. And Kristy, you and I have talked about this a little bit. I don't think non-bankers generally have any idea of how good so much of what's happening in the CRA ecosystem is. And I know I framed it as, gosh, we could be doing something more impactfully, but I also want to say equally that there's a lot of great stuff that is happening, and the story's not getting out there. And just wondering what you all think about that, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think sometimes banks do things for reasons other than CRA, and there's a little bit of a feeling that, the bank, if Google or Apple invests in affordable housing in California, they're not doing it because of CRA. They're doing it because they want to make the community in which the bank or those organizations employ a lot of people better in some way, make it so that people can live close to where they work or find an affordable place to live, period, or something like that. So, there isn't a CRA for those tech companies, but they're doing things because it benefits the community. And, I'd be hard pressed to find in some of these recent corporate announcements from Citi and from Chase and some of the other banks that have made really large commitments in light of the racial issues, that maybe the notion that we're doing it because we have to, or we're doing it because there's a regulatory mandate, doesn't sound as well to the average member of the public. Then we as a corporation feel that we have a duty or responsibility to our communities to do this. And it takes a lot more homework sometimes to find out that the one of the drivers was CRA. So I think a lot of good storytelling does occur, particularly by the bank trade associations, and then frankly through the publications that the Federal Reserve, the OCC, and the FDIC put out. And I do think, being one that puts out a lot of these publications, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to get an institution to be too specific, because maybe there's some proprietary knowledge here that they don't want to be replicated or used by somebody else to compete with after they developed it, and they've sort of put it out there in the public domain. So I think that point was covered by Kristy a little bit earlier, maybe by Jason as well. But that may be one of the reasons why you don't see the billboards on the freeway saying CRA incented us to do this great program, and here are the great results. It's we as a good corporate citizen chose to come together to do Project Lemonade in Manchester because we want a better Manchester.
Thank you, Barry.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, Barry. And I know I touched on that earlier, but yes, I mean, it's, banks do a lot of this work because of CRA in part, but it's certainly not the only reason. And I think, because they are so invested in the community, they are good corporate citizens and naturally benefit and naturally want to see, they want to see their communities do well. And if they see a problem, they want to be part of the solution. And I think they take that role very seriously. So I just agree wholeheartedly with Barry's comments on that.
That's very helpful. Do you think so it sounds like one implication of what you're saying, Kristy and Barry, is that maybe looking to the CRA reports isn't the right vehicle for getting information about impactful practices. That as I think you're each saying in multiple ways, the publications, the conferences, the trade publications, the agencies' publications, there are other vehicles, the professional conferences that the state affiliates, hold, for example, that there are lots of other mechanisms besides the report out.
I would agree with that, Bob. And as you said earlier, you certainly can read the CRA reports to try to get that information, but that's a pretty long and arduous task. It may not be the most effective way. It's a way, but I do think that there are other ways, and Barry shared some of those. And I do appreciate the need for having data-proven solutions, but I think there are a lot of really good anecdotal, but also, just practices that have worked that bankers share in a variety of different platforms like the ones that have already been discussed.
So one of the things that we did in my small ecosystem when I was Darth Vader is working with the council of all the institutions in New Hampshire, excuse me, with educator preparation programs, was we gave institutions the option, if they wanted, to add a section to their self-assessment that would talk about anything that they were doing that they thought was impactful, promising, or proven, or innovative, that they thought was particularly noteworthy, that they would like others to know about, and then how to find out more and what that strategy was and how others could find out about it. And that was very well received. And it was a voluntary mechanism, so that institutions, and I think there's an analogy here with colleges that offer educator preparation programs are competing as banks do for a given market share. They're competing for enrollment, and so they're geographically and otherwise. And so, but they found that that inviting them to have the option, to take advantage of the option to share about what they were doing, that this actually spurred a lot of creative brainstorming with one another and networking about, well, I'd like to learn more about how you're doing that. This is really interesting. I didn't know you were doing that. And again, I guess I come back to my core concern as somebody outside the ecosystem, looking at the challenges of poverty. And I look also, and I've had similar conversations with folks in educational systems and in education philanthropy, that taking siloed approaches has not, I don't think, moved the dial as impactfully as we could. And I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, can something be done? And if so, what might that be to move the needle more systemically on addressing poverty as an ecosystem, if that makes sense? And maybe that's not a fair expectation.
Well, it certainly is a big, question. I think that to really address poverty is going to take a lot of stakeholders, and I think banks are an important one in the community. I don't think they're the only one. I don't think we can be the only one, and nor should they be, but I think that's got to have really diverse support and membership. And just getting back to how is it that we can really work with CRA to to try to coordinate these things. I guess in just my view is, for what that's worth, is I think it's really mission driven, and having a clear mission and a clear kind of approach. I think that certainly gives some comfort to bankers. I think Barry touched on that they've got to, or maybe it was Jason, about how banks have got to do their own due diligence and what it is they're putting their time and their effort into. So I think having a clear mission, a clear objective, and a path to get there, I think is very helpful. It's not to say that I think bankers want to be part of the thought process and the development of that as well. But I think that would be very helpful, and largely a lot of this is mission driven. If it's ultimately a worthy mission, I do think they'll step up to the plate. But with an issue as big as this, you've got to have other stakeholders as well.
Yeah, and to echo that, Kristy, that's certainly what we're finding in Manchester, right? With the New Hampshire Funders Forum, Manchester Proud, the school district, Manchester Community College, Southern New Hampshire University, we're coming to the same realization ourselves, that it's really vitally important and valuable to bring these diverse stakeholders together, so that we're not making our respective contributions in isolation from one another. Really echoes what you're saying.
Well, and Bob, I guess I'll just say this with a bit tongue in cheek, but I believe in your intro to this question, you would describe yourself as being outside of the ecosystem. And just by hosting this event and bringing these diverse stakeholders together, I would very much argue that you are very much part of the ecosystem in your community. And there was a comment put forward by Benita, which I think is a very good one, is that there are groups of CRA collaboratives across the country that are very informal. And the reason that these are effective, I'm part of several of these in my own region, but the reason that these are effective is because you are only accountable to yourself. And you have to remember that CRA is a regulation. It is a federal statute that banks have to comply with. But there is so much other philanthropic efforts. There's things that cities and regions and even to the smallest towns do that are very much relevant to this, but don't fall under the CRA umbrella. The easy one I can think of is beautification. Beautification of putting in new flowers or new streetscapes, or thinking about a new community center. Those are things that still enhance a community and work towards reducing poverty or improving quality of life that may not be CRA eligible, but banks are still going to want to be a part of that. So, I think about this as all being part of the broader conversation, but I would say you are very much part of the ecosystem, and I commend you on your efforts thus far.
That's very kind, Jason. Thank you. Another example, and they were involved in a panel earlier this week, is the really wonderful work that Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund is doing with their bank-on coalitions around the country. And I think there are 84 or 85 of these wonderful coalitions of bankers and United Way and community groups that are looking to address the problem together of financial inclusion and financial literacy for underbanked and unbanked families in LMI neighborhoods. And so that's a whole nother family of collaborative groups alongside the ones that you and Benita mentioned, Jason. Other thoughts that you all would most like non-bankers to understand, as well as bankers, about this whole question of harvesting the great stuff that we're doing so that it makes it easier for others to learn about it and learn from it and replicate. Doing the Zoom wait time thing. Any other thoughts you'd most like to share that we've not already touched on? Well, this is super. Barry, did you have something you wanted to share?
Well, I'm assuming that most people were also during the previous session, but I could talk about the fact that Project Reach, it does have sort of the pilot model as its base for testing a concept that does have the potential for advancing economic inclusion around a product that a bank would be offering through its normal business practice, and really works within the model of this is what banks do anyway. They lend for mortgages, they lend for small business. They want to evaluate people's capacity to repay the credit. If there's a way to expand their market to do more of that and do it in a safe and sound manner, and perhaps even address some of the social challenges we know we're facing, using some tools like we had talked about, then I think, the pilot effort approach, is one, that the market will be receptive to. And that will be one where your original thought of data to back it up really is going to be important. Because if you're going to launch a new credit evaluation utility that's something different than the FICO score, the Vantage score, they are going to want to see the data. And there's going to have to be a lot of data and a lot of validation, and probably a lot more data and evaluation than you would do in a normal, gold standard double-blind study, the way that one of our previous commenters, Michael Young, had commented on. So anyway, that's my only thought on it.
Kristy and Jason, any last concluding thoughts?
Nothing further to add on my end. Bob, just appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all about this issue and appreciate your leadership on it.
Thank you. Thanks, Kristy.
Yeah, and I also thank you for being part of this panel. And I'll just stress the need for innovation. I'll stress the need that I don't think we've conceived collectively of all the pilot efforts that should be undertaken, whether it be New Hampshire or any other part of the country. And you know, a lot of these ideas really came out of a basis for need. And you know, when you tackle these big problems, you know, I guess I'm just a fan of trying to chop them up in smaller parcels to be able to tackle one piece at a time. So instead of addressing poverty as a big P, are there smaller P's that can be addressed? And I think banks want to be a part of that conversation. They want to be seen as partners. They do not want to be just funders. They don't just want to be an entity that writes a check. They want to be part of the conversation, part of the community, and part of the solution.
That's a wonderful note to conclude on. This has been a great pleasure and privilege to be with you this morning. Really want to thank you each greatly for your kind insights and all the good, impactful work that you're doing very quietly and modestly with great humility. It's really inspiring, and it's exciting that we get to play a small part in helping others learn more about the work that you're making possible. So thank you each. And we will send out a link to the recording of this session and encourage you all to share this. Great insights. Thank you all so much and hope you have a safe and wonderful rest of today and weekend. Thank you.